All right, everybody. Well, welcome to my Excel dashboard. This is essentially an analytical comparison between two of my favorite players, Saints running backs Alvin Kamara and Mark Ingram. Now, just to provide those of you who aren't diehard football fans with a little extra context, Alvin Kamara was drafted out of Tennessee in 2017 in the third round by the New Orleans Saints. Now, his rookie season was nothing short of phenomenal as he finished the year with 6.1 yards per carry, which is an NFL record for rookies. He went on to get selected to the Pro Bowl and was named the NFL Offensive Player of the Year. Now, Mark Ingram had a successful season in his own right, getting named to the Pro Bowl and finishing with over 1,500 yards from scrimmage. In fact, both players finished with over 1,500 yards, which was the first time two running backs from the same team have done so in the modern era. So very, very impressive production, which is one of the reasons why we're looking at these two players today. I'm particularly interested in Alvin Kamara because it was his rookie season. I'm kind of fascinated with what he does on the field, and I'm interested in projecting what he could potentially do next year. So let's look through this dashboard. I know it can be a little bit intimidating if it's your first time seeing it and you're not really familiar with it. So let's start by looking at this chart in the top left. This is essentially your yards per game. On our y-axis, we have our yards, and on our x-axis, we have our NFL week. Well, I don't want to say week because there are actually 17 weeks, but there are only 16 games. So these are all 16 games here. The orange area chart represents Mark Ingram's production, whereas the blue area chart represents Alvin Kamara's production. And I'm just going to filter out Mark Ingram here so that we can look at Alvin Kamara for a moment. And you can see that from the start of the season all the way through week 11, where he peaked out at 188 yards, he had a great slope and just improvement seemingly week after week after week. The guy only got better. So this 188 yards, which represents our peak production, that occurred in week 11 against the LA Rams. Fantastic game to watch. That unfortunately ended in a loss for the Saints, but it was an incredible exhibition on the part of Alvin Kamara. I don't want to call that a breakout game because he had so many fantastic games before that point, but that was definitely, I guess in terms of production, where he peaked in his rookie campaign. So let's bring Mark Ingram back into our analysis. Now on this chart, we can see both Ingram's production and Kamara's production in blue here. Below our yards per game chart, we have our touches per game chart. Again, we have Mark Ingram in orange and Alvin Kamara in blue, and you can see that Ingram really dominated the number of touches last season. He had 280-something compared to about just over 200 for Kamara. So kind of really dominated opportunities in that regard. And even more so, if you look at kind of the breakout between rushing and receiving, we're just looking at rushing yards right now. Yards per game, Mark Ingram absolutely dominated. In fact, Kamara only had more rushing yards per game in 2 weeks. Again, one of those weeks was that week 11 game against that Rams. And touches, wow, he's getting so many more opportunities here. Now, if we filter over to receiving yards, though, now we're actually seeing Kamara getting more looks per game and also getting more production in terms of yards per game. So that's kind of an aspect that's a bit interesting to me because oftentimes these two backs are kind of referred to as interchangeable. People say that, well, when Kamara's on the field, you don't know if they're going to run or pass, and the same is true for Mark Ingram. And yeah, to a certain extent, but these statistics seem to point to a higher probability of Kamara receiving a pass and a higher probability of Mark Ingram getting a run in terms of play selection. So let's look at total touch types, and let's move on to our next two charts. And these are actually related. This is total rushing versus receiving yards over the course of the season. Here are our rushing yards, and you can see that Mark Ingram is dominating with a bit over 1,100 yards. And in receiving, you can see that Kamara has almost double the number of receiving yards than Mark Ingram does. Our chart down here, this is total rushing versus receiving touchdowns. In blue, we can see that Alvin Kamara had 5 receiving touchdowns and 8 rushing touchdowns for a total of 13 touchdowns, compared to Mark Ingram's 12 touchdowns. Now, what's kind of surprising to me here is that although Mark Ingram did have a respectable 12 touchdowns, which is awesome, he had 0 receiving touchdowns. And that's a bit of a disappointment just because he followed up, that follows up a season in which he had 4 receiving touchdowns, which, almost puts him on parity here with Alvin Kamara. All right, and our last major dashboard element is a radar chart here. This measures your average yard per touch, and just for simplicity, what I'm going to do is I'm only going to focus on Alvin Kamara here. So I'm going to deselect Mark Ingram. Okay, here we go. So this is Alvin Kamara's yards per touch over last year. Now, you read this the same way you would read a clock. So we basically have our week 1 against Minnesota here, week 2, week 3, week 4, and all the way around until we get to our last game, week 16 against Tampa Bay. Now, the very center of this radar represents 0. The farther out away you are from the center, the higher yards per touch it is. So, for example, our point, which is the furthest away from 0, is right here, and again, that's week 11 against the LA Rams, when Alvin Kamara delivered 17.1 yards per touch. So very, very interesting. It looks like his worst performance was actually in week 1 when he only had 3.8 yards per touch. Now, we can kind of filter this down to both receiving yards and rushing yards. Right now, we're looking at receiving yards for Alvin Kamara, again, peaked week 11 against the Rams, and then rushing yards again against the Rams, where actually it looks like his highest average was in week 3 against Carolina. If we look over here in week 3, he only had 2 touches, but he produced 37 yards at an average of 18.5 yards per carry. So I like that. I also kind of like the shape of the of the line now, because I don't know, it looks like some kind of Batman thing or something like that. So yeah, really, really interesting. Let me filter out so we see both receiving and rushing yards. And now we have both players. So you can kind of compare now Ingram's performance to Kamara's in terms of average yards per touch. And if you look at it, I mean, Kamara is pretty much outperforming him just about every week. You see 1 week here, 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 weeks in which Mark Ingram had a higher yards per touch. Now, you could say that, well, some of that's because Kamara gets more passes, and passes typically go for more yards. So let's go ahead and filter that down to rushing yards. Now we're just looking at rushing yards, and again, what we're seeing Kamara beat Mark Ingram in terms of performance. Here, Mark Ingram has 5 games in which he has a better average yard per touch. And remember, that's in a 16-game season, so 5 out of 16, he's kind of losing the battle there in terms of rushing. And just out of curiosity, here's receiving, and this looks a little bit wild, doesn't it? Looks like, I don't know, some fireworks or something, but here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 games, again, in which he outperforms Alvin Kamara in terms of yards per touch. So, in terms of what we saw last season, I mean, as I mentioned at the onset of the video, Alvin Kamara, he had an absolutely historic season, so it's no surprise to see that he outperformed Mark Ingram in terms of, production per opportunity. What I kind of want to do next, and, actually total production as well, with 1,554 yards versus 1,540. So what I'd like to do last, stay still, dashboard. Okay, what I'd like to do last is I'd like to look at Alvin Kamara's production from last season and use that to create a baseline and a potential projection for next year's total yards. So let's again filter down just to Alvin Kamara. And again, we have some variance here in terms of production per week. At the beginning of the season, while they were still kind of figuring things out, he had lower production. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to focus on the second half of the season here to kind of identify a baseline. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight the last 8 games, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16, and we're going to see what we got here. Obviously, we have a bit of an anomaly right here in Week 13 when Alvin Kamara only produced 27 yards. Reason why that happened is the dude actually got a concussion early in the first quarter, and that's why his touches and his output are so low there. So in terms of like identifying a baseline and making a projection, let's go ahead and eliminate that week. All right, so now we have a total of 7 weeks here. And if you look at our average yards per game, he averaged 125 yards per game. So if you project that over the course of a 16-game season, that's going to put him at 2,000 yards from scrimmage. So doing that would certainly put him in the MVP conversation, and it would be an amazing follow-up to his stellar rookie campaign. So that's actually pretty much everything that I want to go over today with this dashboard and kind of a review of the Saints running backs and a projection for Kamara. I hope you appreciate the unique approach to the football commentary here, and I hope to make some additional videos like this in the future as well, just kind of depending on the feedback and the comments and the direction that the viewers kind of want to see things go. So thanks a lot for taking the time to watch this. I really appreciate it, and I hope you have a great day. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.